It was a cloudy Sunday morning at Redemption Chapel, the town's largest and oldest church. Pastor Leonard Whitlock stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon on family, obedience, and divine order. The congregation hung onto his words, comforted by their familiarity. Unbeknownst to them, Pastor Whitlock's mind was elsewhere. He had received a message the night before. Danielle was returning home, but now as Daniel Whitlock. The letter, neatly typed and signed, explained the years of silence, the personal journey, the transition, and the hope for reconciliation. Leonard sat up all night, the letter clutched in his trembling hands. To him, it wasn't just a name change, it was a betrayal, a humiliation, an abomination. The more he thought about it, the deeper the sense of rage and personal failure burrowed into him. He prayed, demanded answers, pleaded for divine guidance, but as morning broke, clarity never came, only a cold, trembling certainty. Now, during the sermon, the heavy wooden doors of the chapel creaked open. A man stepped in, broad-shouldered, short-cropped hair, wearing a simple button-up shirt and jeans. The congregation turned curiously. A few older members squinted, recognizing the familiar features beneath the new presentation. Leonard's voice faltered. His fingers tightened around the pulpit. He recognized Daniel immediately. Despite the changes, the eyes were unmistakable. His child's eyes. Daniel stood silently near the back, unsure whether to stay or leave. After a beat of silence, he chose to stay. He took a seat in the back pew, hands folded nervously in his lap. Leonard's mouth went dry. His heart hammered against his ribs. He cleared his throat and continued preaching, but the words felt hollow, robotic. He barely noticed the concerned glances of his parishioners. His mind boiled with a single thought. This cannot be allowed here. Not in my house, not in God's house, not. After the service ended, as congregants milled around, Pastor Whitlock made his way slowly down the aisle. Daniel stood when he approached. They were face to face for the first time in years. The air between them was electric with unspoken accusations, hope, regret, and growing dread. "Hello, Dad," Daniel said quietly. Pastor Whitlock didn't respond. He simply stared. The fellowship hall buzzed with muted conversation as parishioners clutched their coffee cups and exchanged nervous glances. The usual after-service chatter was conspicuously absent. A few brave souls approached Daniel, offering uncertain handshakes and polite smiles, but most kept their distance, whispering in corners. Sheriff Clyde Banner, a graying man in his late 50s who had attended Redemption Chapel for decades, watched the scene unfold from near the coffee urn. He'd known Danielle as a child, always polite, a little shy, but a good kid. Clyde's wife, Martha, nudged him and muttered under her breath, "It's not right, Clyde. It's not natural." Clyde said nothing, only sipping his coffee, his mind working quietly. Pastor Whitlock retreated to his office without speaking to anyone else. He closed the door behind him with a forceful thud that rattled the cross hanging on the adjacent wall. Slumping into his worn leather chair, he buried his face in his hands. "God, what have I done wrong?" He prayed silently, the words strangling in his throat. "How could you let this happen to my child?" On his desk, the letter Daniel had sent was neatly folded. Leonard unfolded it again, rereading the calm, earnest words. Daniel spoke of years of soul-searching, of finally living authentically, of the hope that someday his father might understand, or at least forgive. But Leonard didn't see bravery or love in those words. He saw rebellion. He saw humiliation. Worse, he saw proof that he had failed, as a father, as a shepherd, as a man of God. He glanced at the bottom drawer of his desk, where a small pistol lay hidden beneath a Bible and a leather-bound notebook. It had been there for years, a dusty relic he barely thought about. Today, for the first time, the knowledge of its presence brought him an odd, chilling sense of calm. Meanwhile, outside in the hall, Daniel made small talk with a few younger members of the congregation, people who didn't know him as Danielle, only as a newcomer, but the air was heavy. Whispers circulated, judging glances grew sharper. Daniel felt it in every strained smile and awkward step back. "I'm proud of you," one young woman whispered before slipping away, almost embarrassed by her own courage. Daniel smiled faintly but knew he wasn't truly welcome here. Not yet. Sheriff Banner approached Daniel at last, his boots clicking loudly on the tile floor. "Heard you were coming back," Clyde said, voice neutral. "Guess it's been a long time." Daniel nodded. "Too long." There was a long pause. Clyde shifted uncomfortably, then muttered, "Folks around here not used to change." Daniel chuckled softly. "Neither is my dad." From the crack beneath his office door, Leonard watched the interaction with burning eyes. Each smile Daniel received felt like another nail in the coffin of his authority, his pride, his world. By the time Daniel left the church that day, Leonard had already begun crafting a dark, desperate plan. It was not merely about anger anymore. It was about cleansing. It was about restoring order, by whatever means necessary. The week that followed was tense and brittle, like the town itself was holding its breath. Leonard rarely left the church grounds. He claimed to be preparing a new sermon series, but the truth was simpler and darker. He was spiraling inward. In his small office, Leonard pored over scripture, searching not for comfort but for justification. Verses about sin, obedience, punishment filled his mind, twisting and reshaping his thinking. He highlighted passages with angry slashes of his pen, muttering prayers that felt less like pleas and more like ultimatums. He found himself staring at the pistol more often. He took it out one afternoon, cleaned it carefully, methodically, as if performing a sacred rite. He loaded it, then unloaded it, each movement practiced and calm. He even rehearsed in his mind what he would say, how it would happen, how it would be understood afterward as a tragic necessity. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to find small ways to mend old ties. He visited the bakery where he had worked summers as a teenager. Old Mr. Calhoun, the owner, greeted him warmly enough but stumbled over his words, clearly unsure how to address him now. Daniel brushed it off with a smile, used to it by now, but the awkwardness lingered. At the town diner, a few patrons whispered behind their menus when Daniel walked in. Some averted their eyes altogether. Others simply stared, confusion and judgment plain on their faces. Despite the coldness, Daniel remained patient. He visited his mother's grave, a simple stone marker at Harrow's Point Cemetery, leaving a small bouquet and speaking to her softly. "I wish you were here," he whispered. "You'd know what to say to him." Word spread quickly that Daniel had no intention of hiding. He even began attending small Bible study groups at the church again, sitting quietly at the back. His presence was like a stone tossed into still water. Every conversation, every glance rippled with tension. Leonard noticed. At the Wednesday night meeting, when Daniel entered the room, the discussion faltered. The group leader, an older deacon named Mr. Abernathy, stumbled over his words, fumbling a Bible verse about forgiveness. Leonard sat in the corner, arms folded, eyes locked onto Daniel with a cold, heavy stare. Afterward, in the parking lot, a few members approached Leonard with concerned expressions. "Pastor," one elderly woman said quietly, maybe you should ask him not to come back." Leonard nodded, not trusting himself to speak. In his mind, the seeds had already sprouted. If God's house was to remain pure, action was required. And if no one else had the courage to take it, he would. In his home that night, Leonard sat in the dark with the pistol resting on the coffee table. The weight of it seemed to anchor him, steadying his racing thoughts. He rehearsed what he would say again. In his mind, the upcoming Sunday service was no longer about redemption. It was about judgment. Saturday night hung heavy over Harrow's Point. The town's few streetlights buzzed faintly against the dark. In the parsonage behind Redemption Chapel, Leonard sat at his kitchen table, staring at the old revolver lying before him. He had cleaned it twice already, loaded it, unloaded it, reloaded it. The finality of what he was planning neither exhilarated nor terrified him anymore. It simply was. He rose and went to the mirror above the fireplace. His reflection was gaunt, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He barely recognized himself. God tests the faithful, he reminded himself. He needed to be strong enough to act where others had faltered. Strong enough to correct the abomination that stood before him each Sunday. The plan was simple. During the final hymn, when the congregation would rise and bow their heads, Leonard would act. He would declare it an act of righteous cleansing, He would sacrifice what was left of his own life to save his church from moral decay. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel sat on the worn porch of a rented room above the old hardware store. He was writing a letter, his handwriting slow but steady. It was addressed to his father, not accusatory, not pleading, just honest. It spoke of love, of confusion, of a longing for acceptance. Daniel folded the letter carefully and decided he would leave it on the pulpit after Sunday service, whether or not Leonard ever read it. Daniel clung to a thin thread of hope that the walls between them might one day crack. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. Sunday morning dawned gray and close, as if the sky itself were pressing down on the earth. Redemption Chapel filled slowly, the atmosphere unusually heavy. Whispers stirred as Daniel entered and took a seat halfway down the aisle, instead of hiding in the back. Some congregants shifted uncomfortably. A few shot Leonard questioning looks as he prepared to take the pulpit. Leonard's gaze swept over the congregation and landed on Daniel. Calm, steady, unafraid. He gripped the sides of the pulpit until his knuckles whitened. His sermon began in a strained voice, speaking of obedience to divine truth, of purity, of rejecting worldly corruption. His words carried a veiled violence that those closest to him noticed. Sheriff Banner stiffened slightly in his seat near the front, casting a wary glance at the pastor. Daniel listened without flinching. His heart raced, not from fear, but from sorrow. He understood now that he would not be welcomed back. He had climbed a mountain of self-acceptance, only to find the path home, blocked by an immovable wall. As Leonard closed his sermon, he announced they would end with the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." A somber choice. The congregation rose, heads bowed, eyes closed. Leonard's hand slipped into his robe, fingers closing around the cold metal grip of the pistol. The first notes of "Nearer, My God, to Thee" floated gently through the chapel. The organist, unaware of the coming storm, played with reverent devotion. Congregants stood, heads bowed, some swaying gently with the music. Daniel stood too, clutching the folded letter in his hand, heart hammering against his ribs. He planned to walk forward after the hymn ended, to leave the letter on the pulpit, one last attempt to reach across the void between them. Leonard's fingers wrapped around the pistol. His pulse slowed. He breathed deeply, as if savoring the final moments before execution. He told himself he wasn't committing a crime. He was performing a necessary purification. Slowly, he stepped out from behind the pulpit. His black robes swept the floor. To the congregation, it simply looked like the pastor was preparing to lead the closing prayer. No one raised their head. No one noticed anything unusual, except Sheriff Clyde Banner. From the third pew, Clyde's eyes were not closed. His lawman's instincts prickled. He watched Leonard's movements, the stiffness of his posture, the way his hand stayed hidden within the folds of his robe. Clyde's fingers inched toward his own belt, where he carried a sidearm more out of habit than expectation. Daniel took a breath and stepped into the center aisle, ready to walk forward. Leonard moved, too. The congregation continued singing, voices rising in sweet, oblivious harmony. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Leonard pulled the revolver from his robe. The polished metal caught a glint of light. There was a collective intake of breath from the few who noticed. Clyde shouted something, inaudible over the hymn, and lunged forward, but it was too late. Leonard raised the gun with shaking hands and fired. The shot rang out like a crack of thunder, silencing the hymn mid-verse. Daniel jerked backward, the letter slipping from his hand, fluttering like a broken bird to the floor. A bright bloom of red spread across his chest. A scream tore through the silence, a high, raw sound of shock and horror. Daniel crumpled to the floor, gasping once, twice before going still. Leonard stood over him, gun still raised, breathing heavily, his face a twisted mask of grief and grim satisfaction. Sheriff Banner tackled Leonard a moment later, wrestling the gun from his hands as the congregation erupted into chaos. People rushed for the exits, some shouting, some sobbing, some frozen in place. The letter Daniel had written lay near the pulpit, forgotten for the moment in the panic, stained now with a few stray drops of blood. For a moment after the shot, there was only frozen silence. Then the sanctuary fractured into screams and desperate shouts. Several congregants rushed to Daniel's side, dropping to their knees on the blood-slicked floor. Mrs. Calhoun, the baker's wife, pressed trembling hands against Daniel's wound, her voice cracking as she prayed aloud. Another young man tore off his jacket, trying to stem the bleeding. Sheriff Banner barked orders, his voice slicing through the panic. "Someone call an ambulance! Stay back! Everyone else, out!" People scrambled, sobbing and shouting, shoving through the double doors into the pale morning light. The hymn books lay scattered across the pews like forgotten relics of a life that had shattered in an instant. Leonard stood motionless, hands cuffed behind his back. His face was eerily calm, almost serene. He offered no resistance as Clyde led him away from the pulpit and out the side door toward the sheriff's cruiser. As Leonard passed Daniel's crumpled body, he didn't look down. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead. The paramedics arrived minutes later, but it was already too late. Daniel had no pulse. His shirt was soaked through with blood, the letters still partially visible under his limp hand. The ambulance crew worked mechanically, out of habit more than hope, before finally covering Daniel's body with a sheet. Outside, a crowd gathered. Members of the congregation mixed with townsfolk who had heard the gunshot and seen the flashing lights. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some wept openly. Others stood stone-faced, arms crossed tightly across their chests. A few muttered under their breath, words of disgust, or in rare, chilling cases, words of grim approval. Sheriff Banner shoved Leonard into the back seat of the cruiser and slammed the door. He took a moment, leaning heavily against the hood, breathing deeply to steady his nerves. Inside the cruiser, Leonard stared blankly at the dashboard. He did not pray. He did not weep. He simply sat in silence. Back inside the church, Banner's deputies worked methodically to document the scene. They photographed the blood trail, collected the pistol, bagged Daniel's letter as evidence. When Banner re-entered, the organist, an elderly woman named Ruth Donnelly, approached him, her face pale and trembling. I heard him," she whispered. "Pastor Whitlock, right before he pulled the gun. He said, forgive me, Lord." Banner nodded grimly. That detail would matter later. By late afternoon, news of the murder had spread far beyond Harrow's Point. Local television crews arrived, their cameras capturing the church steeple silhouetted against a bruised sky. That night, Harrow's Point was no longer just another quiet small town. It was a crime scene, a place where faith and blood had collided on holy ground. And beneath it all, the town was already beginning to fracture, some mourning Daniel's loss, others quietly justifying Leonard's action. At the Harrow's Point County Jail, Leonard sat alone in a stark gray interview room, his wrists cuffed to the metal table. A buzzing fluorescent light flickered above him, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Sheriff Banner entered, a thick folder under his arm. He set it down on the table with a heavy thud and sat across from Leonard, regarding him for a long moment in silence. Leonard didn't meet his gaze. He stared blankly at the tabletop, his hands motionless. "You understand why you're here, Pastor?" Banner asked finally. Leonard's voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "I did what had to be done." Banner leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You killed your own child, Leonard, in front of 100 witnesses, in God's house." Leonard finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "That wasn't my child anymore." The room seemed to grow colder. Banner didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the folder and laid out the crime scene photographs one by one, the blood, the abandoned hymnals, the letters stained and torn. Leonard's gaze flickered briefly over them, but he showed no visible reaction. "I'll be honest," Banner said, voice low. "Some folks out there, they're already calling you a hero, saying you protected the church from corruption. Others are calling you a murderer, saying you destroyed everything you claimed to stand for." Leonard said nothing. "You don't get to decide who your child is," Banner continued quietly. "You just get to love him, or not." Leonard turned his eyes back to the tabletop. His mouth tightened, but he remained silent. Banner pushed back from the table with a sigh. "Charges are being filed. First-degree murder. No bail." He stood, gathering the photos back into the folder. "You'll have your day in court, Leonard." Maybe you can explain it to a jury better than you can explain it to me." Later that evening, as Leonard sat alone in his cell, the first official statement from the district attorney's office was released. It called the act a premeditated homicide and promised a full prosecution without fear or favor. Meanwhile, the town itself was riven down the middle. At the diner, heated arguments broke out between old friends and neighbors. Some blamed Daniel for bringing shame onto his family and church. Others, including a small but vocal group of younger residents, mourned him openly, organizing a candlelight vigil at the town square. Social media exploded with news articles, opinion pieces, and vicious comment threads. Outsiders condemned the murder as a hate crime. Others hailed Leonard as a defender of tradition. In the midst of the growing storm, Daniel's landlord discovered a second letter tucked into Daniel's rented room, a personal note written to his father, unopened and never delivered. Sheriff Banner took it into evidence, feeling the growing weight of the tragedy pressing down on the small town. As Leonard awaited arraignment and as Daniel's body lay cold in the county morgue, Harrow's Point found itself staring into a mirror, and not all were pleased with the reflection. 3 days after the shooting, Leonard appeared for his arraignment at the Harrow's Point courthouse, a modest brick building now ringed with news vans and protesters. Inside, the courtroom was packed. On one side sat Daniel's supporters, faces tight with grief and anger. On the other, a cluster of Leonard's remaining loyalists, silent and grim, some clutching Bibles as if warding off evil. Leonard shuffled in wearing a county-issued jumpsuit, hands cuffed, his face impassive. He barely glanced at the gallery. He spoke only once when asked how he pleaded. "Not guilty," he said, voice clear and steady. The judge, a solemn woman named Eleanor Vance, reviewed the charges: first-degree murder, unlawful possession of a firearm on church premises, and a hate crime enhancement recommended by the state attorney. The court set no bail. Leonard was returned to jail to await trial. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel's funeral preparations had begun. His friends and a few supportive townsfolk arranged a service to be held not at Redemption Chapel, which remained closed pending investigation, but at the town's community hall. The decision sparked another wave of resentment. Flyers opposing the funeral circulated anonymously, calling Daniel's life an affront and labeling the service a mockery of God's design. Others tore down the flyers, replacing them with posters showing Daniel's face smiling above the words, "He lived his truth. He deserved better." Sheriff Banner quietly assigned 2 deputies to stand watch at the funeral, wary of potential disturbances. The media firestorm surrounding Harrow's Point grew hotter by the hour. National outlets ran headlines like "Pastor Kills Transgender Son in Church Shooting" and "Faith, Family, and Murder, a Town Divided." TV commentators debated whether Leonard's actions reflected a broader cultural sickness or an isolated act of madness. For Banner, it was like watching his town unravel thread by thread. In jail, Leonard remained eerily calm. He read the Bible in his cell and refused to meet with the court-appointed psychologist. When asked if he had anything to say to the public, Leonard issued a written statement. "I acted in defense of the eternal truth. I regret nothing except the confusion sown by evil." His words, circulated by his few remaining supporters, ignited even fiercer debate. Some declared Leonard a martyr. Others branded him a murderer hiding behind faith. The funeral for Daniel was set for Saturday. The community hall was expected to overflow. Sheriff Banner felt a knot of dread tighten in his gut. It wasn't just mourning he expected. It was confrontation. On the eve of the funeral, Leonard sat alone in his cell, thumbing through the worn pages of his Bible. He stopped at a verse he had underlined years before. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." For the first time since the shooting, Leonard hesitated. Just for a moment. The day of Daniel's funeral dawned cold and overcast, the sky a uniform sheet of gray. The community hall's small parking lot overflowed by noon. Dozens stood outside clutching umbrellas, candles, and handmade signs reading, "You are loved," and "Justice for Daniel." Inside, folding chairs lined the room, filled beyond capacity. Daniel's portrait rested on an easel near the podium, a photo taken a few months before his return, smiling easily, full of hope. Sheriff Banner and 2 deputies stood near the back wall, watchful but unobtrusive. A few known Leonard supporters lingered outside the perimeter, murmuring disapprovals but stopping short of open disruption. The service began with a moment of silence. Daniel's childhood friend, Erin Bell, spoke first. Her voice trembled but held steady as she described Daniel's kindness, his courage, his struggle for acceptance. She read part of a letter Daniel had once written but never sent, where he had dreamed of coming home to a place that loved all of me. A few people openly wept. Others sat stiffly, jaws clenched. The next speaker was an unfamiliar figure, a civil rights activist from a nearby city who had driven in after hearing Daniel's story on the news. Her words were sharper, naming the violence that had taken Daniel's life for what it was: hatred. Her speech stirred both applause and muttered discontent from the fringes. As the eulogy ended, mourners were invited to light candles in Daniel's memory. A soft, solemn glow filled the room. Outside, the Leonard supporters, growing more emboldened, held a small, unsanctioned prayer circle, muttering prayers for truth and righteousness. Sheriff Banner kept a wary eye on them but ordered his deputies to hold position. No arrests today if it could be helped. No more violence. By late afternoon, as the vigil candles guttered in the strengthening wind, the town's fracture lines felt deeper than ever. Meanwhile, behind thick stone walls, Leonard Whitlock received word of the funeral. A fellow inmate mocked him cruelly, throwing a rolled-up newspaper into his cell, the headline blaring, "Thousands mourn pastor's son at emotional service." Leonard sat for a long time staring at the picture of Daniel in the paper. For a moment, his fingers brushed the smiling face, almost tenderly. His lips moved in a whisper, though the words were too soft for anyone to hear. Then he folded the paper carefully and slid it under his mattress without a word. In private meetings, the district attorney's team mapped out their strategy. Portray Leonard as cold, premeditated, driven by bigotry and personal shame. Meanwhile, Leonard's defense attorney, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Gregory Downs, began shaping a very different narrative. Leonard as a man pushed beyond reason, acting out of a confused mixture of grief, religious conviction, and mental instability. The trial would not be a simple contest of facts. It would be a war over interpretation, over morality itself. And in the heart of Harrow's Point, the scars of what had happened would not heal easily, no matter which side ultimately claimed victory. The first hurdle before the trial could begin was jury selection. Inside the same courthouse where Leonard had been arraigned, potential jurors sat nervously on wooden benches. Outside, protesters and counter-protesters clashed verbally across the courthouse lawn. Some carried signs with Daniel's face and the words, "Justice for all." Others waved banners reading, "Defender of Faith." Sheriff Banner had doubled patrols, wary of the potential for real violence breaking out. The prosecution fought to exclude anyone who had attended Redemption Chapel or openly supported Leonard on social media. The defense, in turn, moved to strike anyone connected to LGBTQ+ advocacy groups. It was an exhausting, meticulous process, stretching for days. In the end, the jury was selected. 8 women, 4 men, an uneasy mix of backgrounds, none directly tied to the core factions tearing Harrow's Point apart. Yet everyone knew, no matter how neutral the selection appeared, bias was inevitable. Leonard, now thinner and more hollow-looking, appeared at the preliminary hearings dressed neatly in a donated suit. His hair was combed carefully back. His expression remained unreadable. Behind the scenes, defense attorney Gregory Downs prepared Leonard for the trial. They rehearsed phrases, "I acted under sincere belief. I feared for the spiritual welfare of my congregation. I was overcome by grief and confusion." But sometimes Leonard deviated from the script. Late one evening, Downs asked bluntly, "Do you regret it?" Leonard stared past him, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the jail walls. "I regret weakness," he murmured. Then more firmly, "But not the act." It was a dangerous answer. Downs tightened his mouth into a thin line. Meanwhile, the DA's office built a case around cold intent. They planned to present the timeline: Leonard's possession of the weapon, the deliberate concealment, the moment of execution during the hymn. They had testimonies lined up from horrified parishioners, the organist, and crucially, Sheriff Banner himself. In Banner's mind, there was no ambiguity. Leonard had not snapped in a moment of passion. He had plotted. He had waited. He had killed. As jury selection ended, preparations at the courthouse shifted into high gear. Barricades were installed. Extra deputies were assigned. Media outlets arranged live coverage spots. The night before opening arguments, Harrow's Point felt like a town bracing for a hurricane. Everyone locking their doors, holding their breath, praying they would survive the storm without losing what little peace remained. At the county jail, Leonard sat awake on his bunk, Bible open but unread in his lap. He stared at the barred window, where the wind rattled the loose pane. He closed his eyes and whispered something too soft for the guards to hear. Whether it was a prayer for forgiveness or for victory, no one could say. Opening arguments began in a packed courtroom under the gaze of television cameras and sketch artists. District Attorney Marcia Reyes stood before the jury, her voice even and direct. "This is a case about choice," she began. Leonard Whitlock chose to bring a loaded weapon into his church. He chose to hide it beneath his robe, and he chose, with full intent and awareness, to end the life of his child. She outlined the state's case methodically. The letter Daniel had written, the weapon hidden at Leonard's home for days prior, the multiple witnesses who saw Leonard prepare himself during the hymn. There was no sudden madness, Reyes emphasized. There was no confusion, there was planning, and there was hate. Several members of the jury stiffened visibly. Some glanced at Leonard, who sat at the defense table with an impassive face, hands folded neatly in his lap. Then it was defense attorney Gregory Downs's turn. He rose slowly, buttoning his jacket with care. "This case is not simple," Downs said, voice low, almost intimate. "It is about tragedy, about confusion, about a father's profound grief at losing the child he once knew." He cast a glance toward Leonard, who sat upright, almost statuesque. Pastor Whitlock acted during a time of spiritual and emotional collapse. His actions were not the cold, calculated steps of a criminal, but the desperate breakdown of a man who could no longer reconcile his faith, his teachings, and his profound personal loss. Downs did not deny that Leonard had pulled the trigger. His entire strategy hinged on creating sympathy, or at least reasonable doubt about Leonard's state of mind. The first witnesses were called. Ruth Donnelly, the church organist, took the stand, hands trembling slightly as she recalled the horror of that Sunday morning. Her voice broke when describing the hymn's abrupt end, the sight of Daniel falling. "I heard the shot," she whispered. "I heard Pastor Whitlock. I think he said, 'Forgive me, Lord.'" The prosecution leaned heavily on Ruth's testimony to show that Leonard's actions were deliberate and performed in full consciousness. Next came Sheriff Clyde Banner, dressed in his uniform. Banner delivered his testimony with grim clarity. He described Leonard's behavior at the scene, his calm demeanor, his lack of resistance, and recounted Leonard's chilling statement in the interrogation room. "I did what had to be done." Under cross-examination, Downs pressed Banner about Leonard's apparent emotional breakdown in the hours after arrest, suggesting confusion and spiritual anguish rather than cold calculation. Banner remained firm. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't confused. He was sure. Throughout the testimony, Daniel's supporters sat tensely in the gallery. Aaron Bell, Daniel's childhood friend, wept quietly into a tissue. Others held hands tightly or stared forward in blank, silent rage. Leonard's few remaining supporters huddled near the back, their faces guarded, as if unsure whether to cling tighter to their convictions or retreat. By the end of the first day, the courtroom felt drained, as if every soul within it had been wrung dry. The prosecution promised that more damning evidence would follow. Daniel's blood-stained letter, text messages, Leonard's own sermon notes that hinted at judgment and cleansing. But the defense had its own witnesses ready, psychologists, faith leaders willing to testify to Leonard's mental collapse, former congregants who would paint him as a man betrayed by the modern world. The battle lines were drawn. Neither side could win without tearing Harrow's Point even further apart. The second week of the trial began with a wave of physical evidence presented by the prosecution. Photographs of the scene were entered into record. The blood-stained floor of Redemption Chapel, the pistol recovered from Leonard's robe, the crumpled letter Daniel had written but never managed to deliver. Marcia Reyes, the district attorney, moved carefully, piece by piece, building an unshakable picture of premeditation. The letter was read aloud to the court, Daniel's words breaking hearts even in the impersonal tone of the court clerk. "I don't expect you to understand immediately," Daniel had written, "but I hope someday you'll see that I never stopped being your child. I never stopped loving you." Several jurors visibly shifted in their seats. Aaron Bell sobbed openly in the gallery, prompting a short recess. When proceedings resumed, the prosecution brought forward a forensic specialist who testified about the gun, clean, loaded, and hidden with deliberate care. Nothing in its preparation suggested impulsivity. The defense countered by calling Dr. Peter Longmire, a forensic psychologist. Longmire painted a picture of Leonard as a deeply religious man suffering from what he termed identity-based dissonance, a psychological collapse triggered by the perceived loss of his child's identity. He did not see Daniel standing before him that day, Longmire explained to the jury. He saw a stranger. He saw in his mind a destruction of everything he believed sacred. On cross-examination, Reyes was relentless. "Dr. Longmire, are you suggesting that religious conviction excuses homicide?" "No," Longmire admitted under pressure, "only that it contextualizes it." Reyes turned to the jury, letting the implication hang in the air. Context was not exoneration. In the gallery, the town's divisions played out in shifting glances and barely whispered arguments. Some attendees left the courtroom during the more emotional testimonies, unable to endure the rawness any longer. Leonard himself remained detached. Occasionally, he seemed to listen intently, especially when references to scripture or faith arose. But when Daniel's letter was read, he showed no outward reaction at all. A small but critical moment occurred late in the day when a character witness for the defense, a fellow pastor from a neighboring county, tried to argue that Leonard had acted out of holy grief. Under cross-examination, it was revealed that the pastor had posted online comments condoning violence against transgender individuals years earlier. The prosecution seized on the revelation, undermining the credibility of Leonard's faith-based defense. The atmosphere inside the courtroom thickened with a new, bitter weight. As the day closed, Judge Eleanor Vance warned the jury against forming emotional judgments too early. "You must decide based on the evidence," she said gravely. "Not sympathy, not outrage, only the law." Outside the courthouse, the candlelight vigils for Daniel continued. More and more townspeople, people who had once remained silent, now showed up, holding candles against the cold wind, choosing a side in a tragedy that had already left scars too deep for healing. Inside the jail that night, Leonard sat awake again, staring at the ceiling. He whispered verses under his breath, but there was no conviction in his voice now. Only the hollow rhythm of words once filled with certainty, now stripped bare. The courtroom was packed for closing arguments. Some people had waited outside overnight just to find a seat. District Attorney Marcia Reyes approached the jury with visible restraint, her voice low and deliberate. "This case is not about faith," she began. "It's not about theology or private beliefs, it's about choice. A man made a conscious, calculated choice to bring a loaded weapon into a house of worship. He waited until heads were bowed and eyes were closed. He murdered a defenseless man, his own child, not in a moment of confusion, but in a moment of clarity." She paced slowly before the jury, her presence commanding but not theatrical. Daniel Whitlock was not a symbol. He was not a rebellion. He was a son who wanted to come home, and for that he was executed. Reyes's voice hardened, the emotional undercurrent rising just enough. If we allow hate to hide behind the veil of sorrow, if we excuse violence because it wears a familiar face, we betray the very principles of justice we claim to uphold. She stepped back without another word, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Defense Attorney Gregory Downs rose slowly, his expression grave. He spoke in softer tones, as if trying to draw the jury into a private conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have heard the horror of that day, and there is no denying that a life was lost in a tragic and devastating way. He paused, letting the weight of that acknowledgement settle. But ask yourselves, was it the act of a cold, calculating murderer? Or was it the breaking of a man who believed he had already lost his child years before? A man who saw in Daniel's return not a reunion, but a death of everything he had ever known or understood? Downs reminded the jury of Leonard's long-standing service to the town, his mental and spiritual collapse, his prior clean record. Leonard Whitlock is not a monster, Downs concluded. He is a man, a broken man, and while we cannot undo what has been done, justice tempered with mercy is the only true justice we should seek. The judge gave final instructions to the jury. They must decide solely based on the evidence presented, not personal feelings, not public opinion. Then the jury retired to deliberate. In the gallery, Daniel's supporters sat stiff-backed and silent, gripping each other's hands tightly. Erin Bell whispered a prayer under her breath. Others simply stared ahead, hollow-eyed, waiting. At the rear of the courtroom, Leonard's remaining defenders sat huddled in a tight knot, avoiding reporters' cameras, some clutching worn Bibles to their chests. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled. Hundreds now, gathered in tense silence. Candles flickered against the gathering dusk. Some held Daniel's portrait aloft. Others prayed aloud, their voices trembling. Inside his holding cell, Leonard knelt on the hard concrete floor, murmuring scripture to himself, though whether he sought comfort or absolution was impossible to tell. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time since his arrest, his composure cracked just a little. The hours dragged on. Deliberations stretched late into the evening. Everyone in Harrow's Point, and far beyond, held their breath, waiting for the verdict that would not heal the town's wounds, but would at least close one chapter of the tragedy. The jury returned after nearly 8 hours of deliberation. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet electric tension as the 12 jurors filed in, faces solemn and unreadable. Judge Eleanor Vance called the court to order, her voice steady but heavy. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her hair, stood. We have, Your Honor. The clerk read the verdict aloud, the words hanging in the charged air. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Leonard Whitlock, guilty. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Some sobbed openly. Others sat stunned in silence. Leonard showed no visible reaction. His hands rested on the defense table, motionless. His face was pale but otherwise unreadable, a man seemingly neither surprised nor moved by the pronouncement that would define the remainder of his life. In the gallery, Erin Bell buried her face in her hands, trembling with silent, overwhelming grief. Others embraced. Their relief at the verdict mingled with the bitter knowledge that no ruling could undo what had been done. Leonard's few remaining supporters quietly slipped from the courtroom, heads bowed, their numbers smaller and more broken than before. Outside, as word spread, a swell of emotion erupted from the waiting crowd. Vigils turned into tearful gatherings. Some knelt in prayer. Others stood in small circles, holding candles, whispering Daniel's name like a fragile blessing. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but everyone knew what was coming. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Sheriff Banner watched Leonard as he was led away in handcuffs, a hollow figure in a dark suit. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the heavy weight of a life lost, another destroyed, and a town left bleeding. In the days that followed, Harrow's Point tried to move forward, but the wound remained raw. Redemption Chapel remained closed, its doors locked, its future uncertain. Attendance at neighboring churches fell sharply. Conversations that had once been casual became cautious, guarded. Daniel's memory was honored quietly. A scholarship was set up in his name by a coalition of local businesses and private citizens, a gesture of hope pulled from the ruins. At the town cemetery, a simple, polished granite stone marked Daniel's grave. It bore no mention of the tragedy, no hint of the violence that had stolen his life. It read only, Daniel Whitlock, beloved son, lived with courage, loved without fear. On quiet evenings, Erin Bell and a few others often left fresh flowers there, sitting silently on the grass as the sun set over the hills. Leonard's name, once spoken with respect and reverence throughout Harrow's Point, became a dark whisper, a cautionary tale of pride, rage, and irreversible destruction. The town moved on, because it had to, but it moved on differently. Something sacred had been broken in Harrow's Point, something that no trial, no verdict, and no sentence could ever fully restore. And deep in the silence that followed the final gavel, the echoes of that brokenness remained.